North Carolina, late summer heat, a sun that feels like it's peeling the paint off the world, and a boy digging a shallow grave behind an abandoned feed store, bare-handed, trembling, whispering to himself that he didn't mean for any of this to happen. That's where this story begins. Not with the bodies, not with the brothers, not even with the bike, but with the last drifter they ever put in the ground, and the sound of tires crunching gravel as his killers came back for him. The shovel wasn't his. None of this was his. But as the dust settled that morning on Route 17, as the roar of that rust-colored pickup faded, he realized the only sound left was the thud of his heartbeat and the slow realization that he should have run when he still had the chance. That boy is how investigators eventually uncovered what the news would later call the Carolina Massacre. 17 bodies, 3 counties, and 2 brothers no one ever suspected. Because in Carolina, everyone knew the Dalton boys. The Dalton boys fixed fences, helped old women push stalled cars, and mailed Christmas cards even when they didn't have money for stamps. They also buried drifters in the red clay behind their father's old cattle barn. But before we get to the barn, before we get to the 17 graves, before we get to the bike that somehow sparked the worst killing spree the county had ever seen, you need to understand what kind of place breeds men like Clyde and Mason Dalton. Highway 74 slices the state in half like a rusted spine. Mile after mile of gas stations that don't open on time, diners where the coffee tastes like burnt motor oil, and stretches where cell service drops like the population of the towns around it. People pass through, people disappear, and people like the Daltons took note. Truckers called it the dead strip. Drifters called it cheap sleep. The sheriff's office called it not our problem unless someone files a report. That part matters, because most of the victims never had anyone to report them missing. Every homicide detective will tell you, a body is a tragedy, a missing person is a mystery, but someone no one looks for. That's a killer's jackpot, and that's what the Daltons hunted. But not at first. At first it really was about a bike. In 2011, Clyde Dalton bought a Harley Sportster off a guy behind a pawn shop. Paid in cash, no questions. The man he bought it from was a drifter named Tanner Miles, a lanky, sunburned hitchhiker who spent more time sleeping under bridges than inside structures with walls. Tanner didn't own the Harley. Tanner stole the Harley, but Clyde never checked, and he never cared. The second he wrapped his palms around the grips, he felt 10 feet tall. Clyde wasn't used to feeling tall. He and Mason grew up on 40 acres of failing farmland, a dry, cracking piece of land their father inherited and slowly killed through neglect. Their mother left when Mason was 7 and Clyde was 9. Their father drank himself to sleep most nights, and to rage on others. By the time they were teenagers, the Dalton boys had learned exactly 2 things. Don't trust anyone. Hit first. But that bike, that Harley, it made Clyde feel like someone. Mason always said he could hear his brother's mood shift by the way the engine revved. It wasn't just a machine, it was an identity, until the day the cops seized it. Turns out the Harley was listed as stolen from a man in Asheville, an off-duty firefighter named Henry Vale. He wanted his bike back. The sheriff's department obliged. Clyde watched from the porch of the family home as a tow truck hauled the only good thing he'd ever owned down the dirt road. That humiliation sat in him. It fermented, it rotted, and then it hardened into something sharp. And Clyde Dalton decided someone had to pay for it, but he didn't go after the firefighter. No, he blamed the drifter who sold it to him, Tanner Miles. The first grave behind the cattle barn had Tanner's name on it, though no one knew that for another 6 years. When Tanner vanished, no one looked for him. Drifters don't come with paperwork. They come with backpacks, sunburn, and the kind of transient trust that makes them easy prey. Clyde found Tanner outside a gas station 10 miles from the border, said he had money for him, said there was another bike, he needed help moving. Mason later told investigators, Tanner didn't seem scared, didn't seem suspicious, just climbed into the truck like he'd been waiting his whole life for someone to offer him something. Clyde drove him to the barn. Tanner didn't walk out. Nobody knows the exact moment Mason crossed the line from witness to participant. Maybe it was fear of his brother, maybe it was loyalty, maybe it was the same resentment that simmered inside Clyde. What we do know is that by the time Tanner's body was cooling in the dirt, Mason's fingerprints were already on the shovel, and once they realized no one was coming for Tanner, Clyde said the words that would define the next 6 years. If no one cares he's gone, then it ain't really a crime. From there, the brothers developed a routine, coldly simple, horrifyingly efficient. They cruised the dead strip looking for travelers without ties, hitchhikers, runaways, drifters, people who were cold, hungry, or desperate enough to accept a ride from 2 men who looked like they belonged on every Carolina porch in every Carolina town. They learned which questions revealed loneliness, which silences revealed despair, which looks meant they'd found someone no one would chase. 17 times they were right. And that brings us back to the boy digging the shallow grave. His name was Jonah Reeves, 16, homeless since he was 14. The Daltons picked him up outside a shut-down textile mill, said they'd pay him for a few hours of work. Jonah later told investigators he thought they were churchmen, said Mason smiled the whole ride, said Clyde never said a word. When they got to the barn, Clyde shoved him hard. Jonah fell, hit his head on a wooden crate. Mason panicked, tried to pick him up. Clyde pulled him away and said, "He's small, we can dig fast." Jonah heard that sentence through ringing ears. He heard the shovel scrape. He heard Mason saying, "Clyde, he's just a kid. He's just a kid." He heard the barn door slam as Clyde stormed out to get the truck. That's when Jonah crawled. He dragged himself across the dirt, through a gap under the back wall, and into the brush behind the feed store. By the time Clyde got back, Jonah was gone. He didn't run far enough. He didn't know the county, but he ran far enough to buy time, far enough to set everything in motion, because the sheriff's deputy who found him wasn't supposed to be on patrol that night. He wasn't supposed to drive that road. He wasn't supposed to see a blood-covered kid collapsing on the gravel shoulder, but he did. And that's why you're about to hear how the Dalton brothers, a pair of quiet, helpful, good Carolina boys, became the architects of one of the darkest, most methodical killing sprees the region has ever seen. This is the beginning. The end is buried under 17 mounds of red clay. Jonah Reeves woke up in a hospital bed with a concussion, 3 cracked ribs, and dirt still packed under his nails. The nurse told him he was safe. The deputy told him he was lucky. But when the sheriff walked in, took one look at Jonah's shaking hands and asked, "Who did this to you, son?" That was the moment everything started to unravel for the Dalton brothers. Because Jonah didn't answer right away. Jonah looked at the sheriff like a kid who'd been conditioned his whole life to expect that no one would believe him, no one would help him, and no one would stay long enough to actually follow through. He'd been on his own too long, lived in too many abandoned storefronts and bus stations, trusted the wrong adults too many times. But when the sheriff pulled the chair closer and said, "We're not leaving this room until you tell me," something in Jonah cracked. He told them about the barn, the shovel, the older one's temper, the younger one's hesitation, the truck, the smell of gasoline and old hay, the way the moonlight hit the rusted roof as he crawled through the gap beneath the wall, the voices arguing, the phrase he couldn't forget, "He's small. We can dig fast." The sheriff's face didn't move, didn't shift, didn't even blink. He didn't ask Jonah to repeat anything. He didn't ask for clarification. He simply stood, walked to the hallway, shut the door behind him, and told the deputy, "Bring me every map we've got of the Dalton property." To understand why this case almost slipped through the cracks even after Jonah survived, you need to know what the Dalton name meant in that region. The Daltons had been in the county for over a century. Poor, yes. Rough around the edges, yes, but never troublemakers. They were the kind of family that patched roof shingles for the church for free. The kind that showed up with spare tractor parts when your engine died in the middle of planting season. The kind that'd haul sandbags for flood prep without being asked. People assumed the Dalton boys were just simple country men, hard workers. A little strange, but harmless. Nobody knew their father's drinking rages. Nobody knew the nights Clyde slept in the barn because he refused to share a roof with the man. Nobody knew Mason's middle school teachers had documented bruises he always insisted came from helping with farm work. Nobody knew the brothers had been 99% isolation and 1% survival ever since age 7. That isolation shaped them. That isolation fed them. And eventually that isolation hid them. But Jonah's testimony cracked that shell, just enough for law enforcement to look where they'd never bothered looking before. Sheriff Avery Hargrove had known the Dalton boys since they were teenagers. He remembered giving Clyde a warning ticket at 17 for driving his father's truck without brake lights. Remembered Mason offering him homemade peach wine during a 4th of July cookout. Remembered how both boys used sir and ma'am like punctuation. So when he drove up the dirt road to the Dalton farm that afternoon, sun glaring, cicadas screaming like electric wires, he told himself he was only there to ask a few questions, nothing more. But the second he stepped out of the cruiser, he sensed something was off. The barn door was padlocked, the yard was too quiet, and the dog, an old hound named Copper, was nowhere in sight. Copper barked at everything. Everyone knew that. If a leaf blew across the driveway, that dog would go to war over it. But today, silence. Hargrove knocked on the front door. Mason answered. Mason Dalton, the quieter, softer-faced brother, looked pale, sweaty. His eyes were red, as if he hadn't slept. He kept glancing past Hargrove's shoulder like someone expecting something to emerge from the tree line. "Mason," Hargrove said. "You got a minute?" Mason swallowed hard. He nodded. Clyde appeared in the doorway a second later, broad-shouldered, jaw clenched tight, arms crossed. The kind of posture that wasn't just defensive, it was territorial. "What's the problem, Sheriff?" Clyde asked. "Need to ask you boys about something," Hargrove said gently. "About what?" "A kid, 16, says he was here yesterday." Clyde didn't move, didn't blink. Didn't breathe, it seemed. Mason did all three. He stepped back, slightly, barely perceptible, but enough for Hargrove to know Jonah had told the truth. "Mind if I look around?" the sheriff asked, still deliberately calm. Clyde's jaw twitched. "Actually," Clyde said, drying his hands on a rag that already looked worn thin, "we do mind." That refusal was all the sheriff needed. Hargrove left without pushing further. No raised voice, no argument, no threat, just a quiet, "I'll be in touch." And Clyde watched him drive away with the intensity of a man memorizing every movement, every gesture, every step of the process he'd need to undo later that night. Sheriff Hargrove filed for a search warrant immediately, but Judge Winslow, old, conservative, neighborly, wasn't convinced. "You're talking about the Dalton boys," he said. "Those kids helped repair my mother's porch last year." Hargrove didn't raise his voice. "They tried to bury a kid alive," he said. Winslow sighed. "And you have evidence?" "I have testimony." "Testimony from a runaway with a record of trespassing and narcotics possession." "Judge, no blood, no weapon, no documented injuries consistent with assault. You said the boy hit his head on a crate. Could have been an accident. 17 missing drifters on this route in 6 years, Hargrove pressed. And every one of them was last seen within 30 miles of that farm. Coincidence? Winslow said. You know how this state is. Drifters come and go. It took almost 48 hours. 48 hours during which Jonah slept with the lights on and deputies circled the hospital parking lot before the judge agreed to the warrant. By then it was too late. The Daltons knew, and they had spent 2 full nights preparing. Deputies arrived just after dawn. 4 cars. 8 men, shotguns ready, though no one expected to use them. Clyde and Mason weren't fighters. Everybody knew that. But as soon as the officers walked toward the barn, something strange happened. The Daltons didn't run. They didn't argue. They didn't even come outside. They watched from the living room window. Just stood there, Mason trembling, Clyde stone still, while the sheriff's men cut the lock and swung the barn doors open. The smell hit first. Sour, metallic, damp, a smell that didn't belong on any farm. Deputies stepped inside cautiously, shining lights across the dust-choked interior. There were shovels, work gloves, an empty gas can, rope, crates, a table with deep grooves carved into it, drag marks in the dirt, but no bodies, not one. Sheriff Hargrove felt his stomach drop. He walked around the barn slowly, eyes scanning the floor. Something caught his eye, a patch of soil near the back wall, darker than the rest. He knelt, pressed his fingers into it, cold, wet, freshly disturbed. He looked up at his deputies. Start digging. You need to understand something important before we go further. The Daltons were meticulous, not intelligent, not strategic in the sophisticated sense, but methodical. They'd grown up burying livestock. They knew soil density. They knew decomposition. They knew how to make a grave disappear into the land. So the first strike of the shovel revealed nothing. The second, nothing. But by the 15th stroke, deputies hit something soft. They stopped. Silence fell. And when they pulled the dirt back, it wasn't a body. It was hair. Human hair. Long, blonde, matted with clay. Deputy Mills recoiled. Hargrove steadied him. Together they pulled the rest of it up, slowly, gently, until the shape of a human head emerged. Female, early 20s, no identification. Then they found the second grave, then the third, then the fourth. But here's what shook Hargrove most. These graves were empty too. Just traces, signs, remnants, like someone had exhumed the bodies in a hurry. The Daltons had moved them, all of them. 17 graves worth of remains, gone, and nobody could tell where they'd taken them. Deputies stormed the Dalton home. The house was empty. The brothers were gone. The truck was gone. The dog was gone. Every photo was gone. Every personal document was gone. The closets contained nothing but coat hangers, swinging like skeletal fingers. On the kitchen counter sat a single sheet of paper. Sheriff Hargrove picked it up. There were only 4 words written in Clyde Dalton's heavy, blocky handwriting. You should have moved faster. That was the first and last time Clyde ever communicated with law enforcement. The manhunt began immediately. Roadblocks, air patrol, state troopers, K-9 units, checks at bus stations and train stops, alerts sent to surrounding states. Nothing. The Dalton brothers had vanished like ghosts, but they hadn't gone far, because that night, just before midnight. A young couple driving down Route 74 spotted something in the ditch, a dog, Copper, the Dalton family hound, panting, trembling, covered in red clay, and tied to his collar, a strip of denim from a pair of jeans. A pair of jeans later identified as belonging to victim number 7. The Daltons hadn't stopped. They were still moving bodies, somewhere, and every minute that passed made the sheriff realize something horrifying. The brothers weren't running away. They were finishing their work. What comes next is the unraveling, the slow, brutal discovery of how two seemingly ordinary Carolina brothers created a burial network stretching across 3 counties, and how law enforcement for years walked past unmarked graves without ever realizing it. We're about to get into the timeline, the victims, the movements, and the single most chilling pattern investigators uncovered, the one that finally exposed exactly where the bodies went. This is where the story turns darker, more tangled, more deliberate, because the Dalton brothers planned more than anyone realized, and they left clues no one recognized until it was almost too late. By the 3rd day of the manhunt, the Dalton brothers had slipped through 3 counties, 4 roadblocks, and the collective confidence of an entire sheriff's department. Deputies who once swore the Daltons were harmless now whispered theories none of them wanted to believe. Something was wrong with the timeline. Something was wrong with the way the brothers vanished. And something was very, very wrong with the dog. Copper's reappearance was the first break in the search, but it was the kind of break that crawled under your skin and made every officer brace for the next shoe to drop. Because tied to Copper's collar, victim 7's denim scrap was not just a clue. It was a message, a breadcrumb, a warning. Copper was covered in fresh clay, and that clay told investigators 2 things. The Daltons had been digging recently. They weren't burying bodies, they were relocating them. But relocating them where? That question would haunt investigators for months. The answer, when it finally surfaced, was worse than anyone expected. The sheriff's department created a map, one of those giant wall-filling things with pushpins, string, photographs, and timestamps. At first it looked like the usual true crime patchwork. Too many lines, too many colors, too many suspects, and not enough clarity. Then Deputy Mills noticed something strange. Every missing drifter last seen near the Dalton farm had vanished on a day with similar weather. Rain, not storms, not hurricanes, just light, consistent Carolina rain. Almost like the Daltons were waiting for the ground to soften. Mills pulled rainfall data for the past 7 years, lined it up with missing persons. When he pinned the final sheet to the board, the room went quiet. 17 missing persons, 17 rainy days, 17 windows of opportunity where the ground would have been loose enough for quick digging and soft enough for digging twice. Jesus, Mills whispered. They weren't amateurs. They planned every one. Sheriff Hargrove stared at the board, hands on his hips. These boys grew up burying livestock, he said. They knew how to read ground better than any of us, but something still didn't make sense. If they dug graves on rainy days, the bodies should have decomposed quickly in moist soil. That matched what investigators found. Trace remnants, hair, fibers, stains. But the lack of actual remains was the real problem. Where were the bodies now? 2 days later, a hunter stumbled on something that changed the entire investigation. The hunter, an older man named Carver Grooms, was tracking deer in the Pisgah region when he saw what he thought was a tarp stuck in the brush. As he got closer, he realized it wasn't a tarp at all. It was a carpet, rolled up, stained, heavy. Carver called the sheriff, thinking it might be trash from squatters. It wasn't. Inside the carpet were bones, human bones, but not complete. The femur was missing. 3 ribs were missing. Half the skull was missing. It looked like someone had taken the body apart, almost surgically, then relocated it piece by piece. And the carpet? Deputy Mills recognized the pattern immediately. It matched the flooring inside the Dalton family barn. Sheriff Hargrove looked at the woods around them. How far from the Dalton farm are we? He asked. About 9 miles, Mills said. Too close, Hargrove muttered. They dumped this in a hurry. But the biggest revelation wasn't the body. It was the second carpet the search team found 40 yards away, also full of bones. And the third, and the fourth. 9 carpets, 9 partial bodies, scattered across the forest like a breadcrumb trail of horror. Why scatter them? Mills asked. Why not dump them all together? Hargrove shook his head. They weren't trying to hide the bodies, he said quietly. They were trying to spread them so far they'd never be connected. But that theory would soon be proven wrong, because 3 counties over, an entirely different clue surfaced. 2 days after the carpet discovery, a gas station clerk in Yadkin County called the sheriff's station about a weird customer, a man who matched Clyde Dalton's description almost perfectly. Clyde had bought 2 shovels, a set of gloves, 4 gallons of water, a roll of heavy-duty plastic, and a prepaid phone. He'd spoken almost nothing, except one sentence: "Don't bother counting the change." He walked back to a truck that wasn't his. The plates didn't match the Dalton vehicle. But the real moment investigators froze the security footage was when Mason entered the frame. He looked sick, hollow-eyed, unshaven, lost, and scared. He kept glancing at Clyde like a man standing too close to a cliff's edge. Then, just before he stepped into the truck, Mason paused, turned, looked directly into the gas station security camera. Not at the clerk, not at the door. Directly into the camera, and mouthed one word: "Help." Investigators didn't catch it until enhanced playback, but when they did, the whole room went silent. Mason wasn't a willing participant anymore. He was a hostage to his own brother. While law enforcement scoured the forest, the gas station, and the Dalton property, a third clue surfaced in a nearby county. An elderly man named Vernon Price called the sheriff's office late one evening, claiming he'd seen two boys digging where nobody should be digging. Deputy Sanders asked him to describe them. "One was tall," Price said, "built like a bull. The other was skinny, nervous, jumped every time the shovel hit rock." Sanders stiffened. "Could they be brothers?" "Yeah," Price said. "They looked like each other." "What were they digging?" There was a long pause over the line. When Price finally answered, his voice cracked. "A pit," he said. "Big enough for a damn tractor." "Where?" Sanders asked urgently. "In the old quarry," Price replied. "But by the time I got close enough to yell at them, they were already covering something with tarps." He hesitated. "And Sheriff? One of those boys?" He looked like he was crying. It was quiet, empty, still. The pit was real, huge, irregular, the kind of hole two men could have made overnight if they didn't stop to rest. Shovel marks lined the entire perimeter, and pieces of tarp still fluttered on the edges like burned flags. The pit wasn't fully filled in. Mills jumped in first. He didn't need a shovel, not immediately, because the moment he hit the bottom, his boot landed on bone, a jawbone, human. More digging revealed more remains. Skulls, ribs, vertebrae, mixed in a chaotic mass like someone had tossed bodies together with no organization. But when they found the skull with a distinctive silver canine tooth, they knew exactly who it belonged to. Victim 2. They'd found the missing bodies, but they hadn't found the Daltons, and the pit wasn't filled in yet, which meant the brothers planned to return. Sheriff Hargrove stood at the edge of the pit, staring down at the tangle of bones. "He's concentrating them," he said. "He's moving them from separate graves to one location." "Why?" Mills asked. Hargrove's voice hardened. "To destroy them all at once." In every serial case, there's always that moment, one defining turn, where investigators stop asking what happened and move on to why it happened. For the Daltons, nearly everything pointed back to the stolen bike, but that explanation was too simple, too clean, too convenient. The murders escalated beyond revenge long before the victims reached double digits. This wasn't about Tanner Miles anymore. This was about power, control, and more specifically, Clyde Dalton's desperate need to erase humiliation wherever he found it. "You steal from me," Clyde once said to a local mechanic, "and I'll take it back piece by piece until you're lighter than air." At the time, everyone laughed. They shouldn't have. Psychologists later called Clyde a classic case of displaced rage. He'd been humiliated by his father, humiliated by the law taking his bike, humiliated by poverty and circumstance. So he found an outlet. Men nobody looked for, women nobody reported missing, kids like Jonah, who lived under radar. Mason's motive was different. He wasn't violent by nature. He was submissive, conditioned since childhood to follow Clyde's lead. Investigators believed Mason helped bury the bodies out of fear, not cruelty, but fear was enough. Fear helped kill 17 people, and fear kept him from reaching out, until that moment in the gas station, where he mouthed that one-word plea: "Help." 3 weeks into the manhunt, something happened that cracked the case wide open. A farmer in Wilkes County reported an abandoned truck on his property. The plates belonged to a vehicle reported stolen 2 days earlier, the one the Daltons had used after ditching their original. Deputies approached cautiously. The truck was empty, windows fogged, seats pushed back like someone had slept in them. But on the passenger side floorboard was something investigators hadn't expected. A notebook, cheap, weather-warped, pages smeared, but legible. It was Mason's handwriting. The entries were short, fragmented, scrawled in panic. "Clyde says we have to move faster. He says they're coming. He says I owe him. I can hear them at night, the ones we buried. Clyde says I'm weak, says if I don't help him finish, I'll be number 18. Deputy Mills felt his blood run cold. "Mason's terrified," he whispered. "He's turning on Clyde." Sheriff Hargrove tapped the last page with his finger. Mason had written coordinates. Coordinates that pointed to one place, a hunting cabin deep in the woods. A cabin owned by the Dalton family for over 40 years. A cabin that hadn't been used since the boys were children. A cabin no one had checked yet. Sheriff Hargrove didn't call for backup. He didn't assemble a convoy. He didn't wait for tactical. He took Mills and Sanders, just the three of them, and drove straight into the woods. The deeper they went, went, the narrower the road became. Trees pressed against the cruiser like skeletal hands. The air grew damp, thick, unmoving. Finally, the cabin appeared through the trees. Dark, tilted, half-rotted, windows boarded. No truck in sight, no smoke from the chimney, no voices. Sanders whispered, "Think they're inside?" Hargrove didn't answer. He walked toward the cabin, slow, steady, hand on his gun, and at the base of the porch steps, he stopped. Because scratched into the wooden riser, fresh, raw, desperate, was a single word. Run. Mason had left it. But run from what? Or from who? What comes next is the confrontation. The moment law enforcement finally steps into the darkness behind that cabin door and discovers how the Dalton brothers' story ends, how the final body was claimed, and why the truth of the 17 drifters would haunt that county long after the case closed. The fourth part is where we reach the breaking point. The cabin, the pit, the brothers, and the last decision Mason Dalton ever made. This is where the story hits its darkest moment. You're about to enter the endgame. The wind clawed through the tree line that bordered the Dalton property. That same low Carolina hum that carried through every season, matching the pitch of something ancient, something that had been waiting decades to be uncovered. Deputies said later that the place felt wrong the second we stepped out of the cruiser. But no one had the vocabulary in that moment to explain what wrong truly meant. How could they? They were stepping into the final chapter of a story stitched together by violence, desperation, and a brand of backwoods logic only the Dalton brothers understood. Yet the truth is this: the climax didn't begin with the backhoe, or the dogs, or even the warrant. It started with a man named Lewis Faraday, a paralee from Georgia who wandered through the wrong patch of South Carolina pines and stumbled into the ghost that would unravel everything. Lewis had seen the bike, the same old, beaten-down Yamaha that disappeared with one of the drifters years ago. He recognized it from a flyer pinned inside a gas station restroom. He remembered it because the missing man was from his hometown. Lewis didn't intend to get involved, didn't intend to say a word. But curiosity is a disease, and the Dalton property was a place people whispered about the same way they whispered about sinkholes and snakes and the things that live under floorboards. He followed the sound of an engine once thought dead. He peered through a slat in the barn wall, and he saw Ethan Dalton, sweaty, red-faced, wrestling with the Yamaha's rusted chain like it belonged to him. Lewis ran, the Daltons chased, and for the first time in nearly 10 years, someone escaped them. When Lewis stumbled into the sheriff's substation, half delirious, lungs on fire, arms scraped raw, everything cracked open. He told them about the bike, about the brothers, about how he heard screaming from the back of the barn, about how he didn't know if it was human or animal, about how he didn't care. He knew he needed out. Sheriff Coleman, who spent 20 years believing the Dalton boys were dangerous but not lethal, finally faced the horror that had been growing in the soil right under his jurisdiction. He took Lewis seriously because Lewis looked like something had peeled the soul from his spine. Within hours, the warrant was approved. Within 10, the property was surrounded. Within 12, the Daltons were in cuffs, swearing up and down that everyone was lying. And within 24 hours of the first shovel breaking ground, deputies found the first skull. It wasn't deep, just 30 inches down, placed there like a warning. Sheriff Coleman made the call before the coroner even arrived. "We're not stopping until we hit China." The dig expanded fast, turning the Dalton acreage into something between an archaeological site and a battlefield. Deputies, forensic teams, state bureau agents, they all felt it. They described it later as digging into a secret the earth didn't want to give back. Body after body after body. Some still had belongings, wallet fragments, belt buckles, rings. Some were bound. Some still had duct tape clinging to the bone like leeches. 17 in total. 17 drifters. 17 ghosts tied together by a bike that wasn't even worth $50. The pattern became clear. The Daltons picked victims who wouldn't be missed. Men who passed through town, slept near the highway, drank alone, moved on without leaving fingerprints on the world. The kind the Dalton brothers believed no one cared about. The brothers themselves broke differently under interrogation. Ethan tried the tough man act, arms crossed, jaw tight, nostrils flaring like a bull, but he cracked the second they placed a photo of the Yamaha in front of him. They say he stared at it for a full minute before muttering they should have minded their business. Reuben, the younger one, barely spoke at all. He kept rocking in his chair, eyes unfocused, whispering under his breath like he was speaking to someone sitting right beside him. When he finally snapped out of it, he said a single sentence. "We didn't kill nobody who didn't walk into our lives first." A justification, a creed, a small-town death philosophy. The truth unraveled like barbed wire, jagged and choking. The brothers' motives were as pathetic as they were horrifying. It started with one drifter stealing a bike Ethan believed was his. It wasn't even his, not legally, not on paper, but possession was 9/10 of the law in Ethan's mind. He confronted the drifter. The drifter fought back, and Ethan killed him with a hammer. Reuben helped bury the body. They told themselves it was self-defense. They told themselves it was a one-time thing. But guilt mutates, and theirs mutated into something feral. Every drifter after that was a threat, a potential thief, a danger to the sanctity of their property, a reason to repeat what they convinced themselves was justice. Victims became fertilizer. The barn became an execution room. The bike became a symbol, Ethan's trophy, his proof that everything he did had a reason no sane mind could understand. The autopsies painted a brutal picture: blunt force trauma, knife wounds. Some victims suffocated, some were shot. All of them were discarded like meaningless scraps. 17 men whose stories ended in the dirt of a family that believed the world owed them something. The trials were a spectacle. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, turning it into a circus of cameras and microphones. Relatives, the drifters, never knew they had crawled out of the woodwork. Advocates for the homeless demanded better protections. Documentarians descended like vultures, hoping to snag rights to the next American horror story. Ethan showed no remorse. Reuben cried only once, when the photos of the graves were projected onto the courtroom wall. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Both were given consecutive life sentences. But the story didn't end there, because the property, the Dalton land, that cursed patch of Carolina soil, still held secrets. Cadaver dogs signaled in places no human remains were found. Some investigators insisted the ground felt disturbed in areas mapping technology couldn't fully interpret. People speculated about unmarked graves, earlier victims, or the possibility that the brothers didn't act alone. To this day, law enforcement can't say with certainty that 17 is the final number. Some believe there are more, and Lewis Faraday, the man whose fear broke the entire case open, disappeared into witness protection after testifying. Some folks say he still wakes up screaming, certain that he hears the Yamaha's engine outside his window. Others say he moved to Montana and never looked back. But the truth is, stories like this don't end cleanly. They don't stop haunting people just because a courtroom closes. On humid nights, when the cicadas screech loud enough to drown out thought, locals swear they hear digging coming from the Dalton property. The land has been sold twice, but neither family stayed longer than a year. Maybe it's imagination, maybe it's guilt, maybe it's the earth remembering, because 17 men didn't choose to die there. They were erased, buried by brothers who believed the world wouldn't miss a few drifters. But the land remembers everything, and some graves never stay quiet.